All right, what is up, YouTube? Welcome back to the second tier list in this iteration. It's less a tier list than just a discussion on these cards. We've done hand traps already. If you haven't seen that video, go check it out. We're doing tech cards slash board breakers now. All your power spells, all your going second monster cards, and what I think they are going to be like in the upcoming format, how good they're going to be. We're using the same tiers as in the hand trap category, as of like the cards that are very good can make it into your main deck. The situational cards are like really good against some decks and not very good against others, so you might want to think about rather siding them. Then decent cards are like solid in the main deck, they're all right, and then we got mediocre and bad. So here we go. Feather Duster, it goes into the situational category because I don't even think it's bad against any of the decks, really. The only deck I can really think of where it's genuinely bad when you go second is Branded, because like Kashtira, it hits some stuff. Sprite, it'll hit like Smashers, Double Cross, or Force and Negate. Obviously good against Labyrinth, obviously good against Runic decks, even though they can protect with Hugin. Duster is good going second against most decks, but it's really bad going first. And against some decks, like Kashtira, yes, you hit some cards, but you hit the less important part of their board, right? You look at a Kashtira board, you're like, I think that Arise Heart is a bigger problem than that Birth in the back row. You know what I mean? So Duster is okay, but I think I would stick to side decking Duster in this upcoming format. I think that's my suggestion for Duster. And back row removal in general. The same goes for Lightning Storm. If you're really paranoid about back row decks, I think it's okay to play Lightning Storm and Duster in your side decks. I would not recommend main decking these. Let's talk about this category all together of the monsters that tribute your opponent's shit. Kurikara, Kaiju's, Santa Claus, which is technically the same as Kaiju's, Lava Golem, and Sphere Mode. So, Santa Claus, out of all these, was only really good in Purely. Now, I'm not going to go over the reasons why it was good in Purely and not good in other decks. Again, we've talked about this a billion times in the past. This card was specifically good in Purely. If you're not playing Purely, don't play Santa Claus. If you still are on like a going second Purely Copium kind of train, you can play Santa Claus, but in any other decks, Kaijus are better. Which Kaijus, I think, are decent cards. They are still really powerful against Kashtira specifically. Now, the question is, how popular is that deck going to be? I don't think it's going to be that popular, which is why I'm only putting them in decent, because in other matchups, you would really rather have other cards than a Kaiju. From my mind, it's hard to predict how popular Kashtira is going to be because I'm personally not considering it, but I think a lot of people still are. So we'll see about that. Kurikara, on the other hand, I think is still a very good card. Now, whether you want to main deck or side deck Kurikara is up to each on their own. I think the card is still very good, simply because against Kashtira, it's as good as ever, but against other decks, I think it's significantly better than a Kaiju. Like, for example, against Sprite decks, it's so much better because you just play into their board, you bait some of their stuff, you tribute their shit, and Sprite just doesn't really have the follow-up anymore. It's not great against Branded and Labyrinth, to be fair, so maybe it's more like a top of the situational category where like maybe you side deck it if you want to respect decks like Branded or Labyrinth a little bit more. Kurikara is definitely up there in terms of tech choices for this format. Sphere Mode and Lava Golem, honestly, I think are losing a lot of appeal right now, at least in my mind, because I'm like, those cards were typically used to counter the greedy Kashtira players and also some of the combo piles. Now, both of those things don't really exist anymore. Kashtira can't really go greedy anymore without Diablosis. There's no combo line really that plays into these guys. I think most of the time they're just gonna go Arise Heart pass. So I think I'm throwing these into this category. I don't know if now is the time for these cards. We have Encore and Herald of the Abyss here. Both of those cards are bad. Similar to Santa Claus, both of those cards only really saw play because of Purely being a thing. Now that Purely isn't really a thing anymore, those cards lose a lot of their appeal. Book of Moon and Book of Eclipse, I think, are still cards that you can consider. I don't think they're particularly great because, quite frankly, I just think there's going to be less Kashtira. And Kashtira was the main reason for these cards. The one big deal about these cards is that they work when you draw them when you go first. That's a big deal about board breakers. Usually, you look at 90% of these cards, they are bad when you go first. And a lot of decks are taking this trade-off of, hey, this card is bad when I go first, but it's really good when I go second, because of how impactful board breakers can be when you go second. The thing is, Book of Moon and Book of Eclipse don't have that. They are playable and useful and good when you go first. So that's a big selling point for books, in my opinion. However, going second, I think they are much worse than other options. So there's that. Unless you're playing against Kashtira, of course, then they're pretty good. Chalice, I don't even know why this is here. This was like a very short time in the light for Forbidden Chalice where it saw play during Kashtira format because people thought it was a lot like Zodiac format, and like one-on-one effect negation was kind of handy going first and second. It still is like that, but I don't know if I like Forbidden Chalice enough. Change of Heart, I think, is pretty good. I don't think you're gonna main deck Change of Heart because there's just some matchups where it's not great. Against Branded, if they go for a puppet lock, Change of Heart is completely dead. Against Labyrinth, I don't think Change of Heart is that great. But now that you cannot go for a back row zone lock anymore, in deck building, you have to not be afraid of that at all. So you can now be sure that all of your spell cards will resolve against Kashtira. Unless they have Forbidden Lands, you beat the Arise Heart with a single Change of Heart, Mind Control, Talents, those kind of cards. You will beat the Arise Heart, which makes this card a lot better, I think, a lot safer. So I like this card as an option. Board Destruction is mid, I want to say. I don't really see a matchup where you would rather have these cards over other cards. I don't think they're bad. I don't think they're good enough to call them decent. They're okay. Forbidden Droplet is currently not that big of a deal, not that hot of a card. It goes to show that we're not in a very toxic environment right now, where people aren't really making the most insane, crazy auto win boards, which is where normally cards like Droplet would really be necessary. Right now, we don't really have that. I think at maximum, Droplet would be a side deck card. But even at that, I think it's relatively mediocre. Enemy Controller is decent. If your deck has synergy with it, you can play it, I think. Once again, another card that has this cool side effect where it's not completely dead when you go first. You can still take your opponent's stuff when you go first. Sometimes something as simple as preventing your opponent from attacking by switching something to defense can matter when you go first. I've had games where that mattered. So I think Enemy Controller is a decent card. And now we're getting into some heavy hitters. Evenly Matched is as good as ever. Gets a lot better with this last ban list. If anyone remembers, YCS London format, Evenly Matched was very popular. The card is quite frankly just crazy right now because decks just don't make hard negates most of the time. The only reason why this card wasn't insanely popular in the last couple weeks was because Super Heavy Samurai made a bunch of Omni negates. And Super Heavy Samurai is, by all intents and purposes, either gone or a lot weaker and a lot less popular than it was before the ban list, which I think means that Evenly Matched is back. I think people are going to main deck Evenly. Most of the current top decks are weak to it. It's worth noting that if your deck really struggles against a Rise Heart, it might not be the best choice for you because, of course, if you activate Evenly against Kashtira, they will keep the Arise Heart. They will banish everything else, right? So if your deck typically loses to the Arise Heart, then you might not want to play Evenly. But if your deck can play against a Rise Heart, but typically loses to like Birth follow-up, Preparation follow-up, Lance, Book, those type of cards, the Field Spell maybe even. If you lose to the rest, then Evenly is the card for you, you know? Won't Runic decks always go for Carrot? Runic Sprite is the one exception where they will have a way to negate the card, but sometimes you can bait the Carrot by like imperming it. There's ways to resolve the Evenly against Runic decks as well. It's just a very solid card. Fenrir is another card that I think is a great card, and this is outside of Kashtira, of course. I mean, of course, you're going to play this card in Kashtira, but like in other decks, I think Fenrir is just solid because it's good going first, good going second, outs certain cards. It forces a Rise Heart on its own, which is something that not all the cards here do. Mind Control, I think, is a lot worse than Change of Heart because like you can't attack, of course, and that's a big deal, I think, because cards like Zeus exist, and that's a big downside for Mind Control. Pancratops, I think Pancratops is decent. I don't think you're gonna main deck Pancratops at all, but it's like one of those cards where if you're really worried about Floodgates and you just want one more overall solid card, I think Pancratops could be it. It's good against Sprite just because it's big. I can see myself siding the Pankratops again in this format. I think it's all right. Super Poly. Hard to evaluate without knowing exactly which the best decks are and what boards they make. For example, this card has the potential to be pretty good against Branded, depending on what board they make. This card has the potential to be really good against Sprite too, depending on what board they make. You can even use it against Labyrinth sometimes. There's even fringe scenarios where you can out a Floodgate against Labyrinth by super polying your own card. For example, you can make a Zeus, summon another light monster, activate Zeus, then super poly into Mud Dragon, so the Zeus resolves, stuff like that. I think Super Poly is a situational card, but it could pop up again in this format depending on what people do with their boards. It's worth noting that it's going to be pretty bad against Kashtira, because the only way Kashtira ever played into Super Poly was Diablosis, I feel like. Maybe you can side deck it for certain matchups. Dark Ruler No More, I think, is another one of those cards that was pretty good in this current format before the ban list dropped, but that was also, I think, because of Super Heavy Samurai mostly. I think it's a little bit situational for my liking. It negates the board, but it doesn't break the board, which is a big problem in a lot of decks. Like, for example, Runic decks have a big problem outing the board after Dark Ruler. Sprite decks in general, not just Runic Sprite, don't really like having to kill 3 or 4 bodies because sprites are all small little, you know, weaklings. So I think if your deck is very good at removing stuff off of the field, then Dark Ruler is okay. But in some decks like Sprite, like Runic, I don't love the card. I think it's okay in something like Branded, where you can just go second, Dark Ruler them, start playing, and then you just Mirror Jade one thing, Guardian Chimera some other things. In those decks, it's fine. So I'm gonna throw it in situational. Ultimate Slayer. Oh, I love this card, dude. I love this card. It's so close to being playable. I think it's decent, actually. I've played it in Labyrinth last format, and I think Labyrinth is one of the decks that could realistically play this card, because it is pretty alright in any matchup that isn't Kashtira. It's pretty good against Sprite. It's pretty good against Branded, especially if you're playing a deck like Labyrinth that doesn't care about being puppet locked. Branded will not go for the puppet lock against Labyrinth, because that's just, it's stupid. Why would you do that? So in those matchups, you can just like Ultimate Slayer their board away, and you maybe even prevent Guardian Chimera. You can like player, send Entis, out Mirror Jade, pop the Branded in red before they can Guardian Chimera you. It's pretty nice. It's not good in every deck. It's not good against every deck, but it's got some potential, I think. Talents is a very good card still. I mean, going second, it's going to be great. Going first, it's going to be useful a lot of the time. Like, Ash is a hand trap that's going to be in a lot of decks, right? Even if other hand traps aren't as popular, that card is going to be popular. I think we're going to look at a lot of main deck talents this format. Thrust, I'm not as big of a fan of, but I'm still going to throw it in situational because it can be very solid, specifically when you go second. Going first, I don't have that much faith in Thrust than Talents, because it's a lot easier to make Talents life when you go first. And going second, Thrust, honestly, most of the time, it's probably going to grab Talents. So like, Talents is just the better card. Thrust can grab cards like Duster or Evenly, so I think sometimes it's better. That's my one big issue with Thrust, is when I go first and my opponent ashes me, they don't have a monster. What do I do with Thrust? Does my deck have a great way to use it or not? If yes, then maybe I use it, right? All right, and that's my opinion on the most important tech cards for the upcoming format. If I've missed any card that you are interested in, feel free to let me know in the comments down below, and I'll try to answer your questions. Keep in mind, this is a first impression of the format, so take it with a grain of salt, but I hope this was helpful for your preparations for upcoming events. I hope you enjoyed watching. If you did, make sure to subscribe to the channel and like the video, and thank you for watching. See you guys next time. Bye bye. Say goodbye to YouTube, chat. Peace.